Is it working? Yes, it is.
Actually, do you want to share them so she keeps?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can. Oh, okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to a last session of the day. We'll try to be very innovative and keep you awake. So, talking about fostering innovation, we can be innovative and have an hashtag. It's like we can do innovation IJF16 if you want. I don't know, whatever. So with me on the panel, Sebastian Horn, project leader Ze.tt, Mitra Kalita, the managing editor at LA Times, Fergus Bell, news consultant, and Ingeborg Volan, director of digital development and Adresseavisen.
That's pretty good.
Good. So we'll try to understand how do you foster innovation and if there is a recipe for innovation. Sebastian, do you want to start telling us what you're doing and how are you innovating German media?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Sebastian Horn. I run Ze.tt in Germany. We're a publication by Die Zeit, or Zeit Verlag, which is also a traditional legacy print and online publication. And about a year ago, they decided to set up a startup to reach a young audience with a completely new brand online. So their approach to innovation was to actually create a completely separate team with its own newsroom, also with its own office space, and foster innovation completely outside of existing structures and newsroom teams, with the goal to make that into a successful startup in and of itself, but also to learn something that the other newsrooms then can take away from that, and we can see that this is already working. So we created our own newsroom culture, we successfully launched our own website, we successfully launched on social media platforms, but I would claim that we do already have an influence on our sister publication Zeit Online and perhaps even on our print weekly.
So, Fergus, does innovation requires shiny new tools, or is more a question of people, workflow, processes?
I think, how many people in this room have persuaded your organization or someone to purchase a tool that has been an amazing thing for your newsroom but hasn't been utilized because staff don't know how to use it, or there's too many functions? Okay. I think it's a common thing to happen, that there are so many amazing tools out there. They're shiny, they do all the things, they have all the bells and whistles, they solve your problem completely if your newsroom fitted into their version of what the problem is. And so the reason why the problem about innovation doesn't get fixed in newsrooms isn't because the tools aren't available. I think it's a lot to do with the culture of the newsroom and resistance to change, or resistance to a change in your job, or fears over your job. And there's a tendency to protect what you know and what you can do. But the time of sitting in the same job has gone if we want to be a journalist now. Those tools could work for us, but things need to change within ourselves in order for that to be able to happen.
How does senior management play a role in fostering innovation? Do you have in place in your regional outlet in reward system?
I would have to say that that's one of the things that I think we discuss too little in the media industry, is the role of senior management and senior newsroom managers in fostering innovation processes. We talk about it a lot in startups. There's a whole lot of methodology around the entrepreneur and this charismatic power, being able to pull people to him or her and executing their idea and their vision. But actually, I'd say that senior management in legacy newsrooms too. By the way, I'm head of digital development in Norway's oldest newspaper. That sounds like a contradiction in terms. It actually kind of works, but senior management plays a vital role in this, maybe particularly in legacy media. Because sort of, what do you reward? What are the stories you discuss in newsroom conferences? Who gets sent to conferences and training camps? what sort of people are hired or promoted, or even what sort of stories or what sort of developments get resources. Those are decisions made by senior managers. And senior managers, if they are conscious of it, can play a really important role in fostering innovation within a traditional newsroom. And I think also maybe the most important part, and that's what makes some entrepreneurs so successful, in painting a picture not only of, oh, we need to change, but this is where we're going. This is what I want you to aim for. This is what we're trying to achieve together. That's one of the roles that we don't discuss enough in the media industry, I think.
Mitra, you've been both sides. So we tend to look at legacy as a burden sometimes, but are there any benefits of being a legacy media and trying to innovate?
So I spent about the last 10 years before moving to the LA Times in startups of various fashion, for the most part startups within larger media companies. Right before the LA Times, I helped launch Quartz, which is the global economy site of The Atlantic. And before that, I had launched a New York section for the Wall Street Journal and launched a newspaper in India called Mint before that. So I'd come out of a stream of startups. And what happens in that environment is that because you're new and you're trying to build audience as well as build a staff, you articulate your mission, if not daily, maybe hourly. I mean, it's a very, very crucial part of recruitment and of finding customers and finding readers, is articulating who you are. So for me to come to the LA Times, which is a 134-year-old organization, and spend my time articulating who we are, you could just imagine kind of what that looked like. And yet, because I came out of startups, I actually did feel like there was an importance on articulating the mission as it relates to creating the newsroom of the future. And I feel like what I've focused on for the last year is not doing that in the same terms that startups have used, which could at times actually feel academic or theoretical, right? Because you don't have stories that demonstrate what you're promising the market. In something like the LA Times, I mean, just to get back to what is the role of senior managers in creating an environment like that, I actually found it much more beneficial to speak specifically on stories, right? What is the way that we are going to be innovative on this specific story? And if your meetings are only talking about linear storytelling, well, that's what's going to be rewarded. If that's what your senior managers are asking for, that's what's going to be rewarded. If you start to showcase Snapchat and how you covered a red carpet movie opening, and suddenly the room of senior managers sees that every day a different type of storytelling is being mandated, it becomes a part of the culture. Now, that is kind of, it might sound like a silly example, but actually, if you think about the way a newsroom like ours, a legacy newsroom, orients itself every day, it is with a daily meeting. And so you start to look at what are we spending our time on there, and I think that's how you articulate what the mission of even a legacy organization is.
And so if we think of tech innovation and editorial innovation, sometimes those are both happening at different places in the newsroom. How do you bring them together?
I think you have to answer the question first whether innovation in tech is right for your news organization, because actually it might be incredibly expensive to develop something in-house when you could buy into a company that has been producing innovation, a product or a tool that you need, and can afford to continue to update it and to keep across it. Whereas if you're doing that in-house, it becomes incredibly expensive to do that. So, you know, tech, if you're a big news organization, then you have the ability to do the technical side as well. But sometimes, I think to innovate might be to say, okay, we're going to let go of this part. This is not something that we know so much about. There are people out there who know much more, and if we work with them, we can innovate faster and better.
I would just jump in to say that off-platform, I think for a lot of legacy organizations has been actually incredibly liberating. That we are able to just, say we're going to launch a Tumblr within a week devoted to, we just did this, the people in places of Los Angeles, and we're just going to see what we find. And it ended up being very nimble in its creation, because it was like, we're open to this off-platform in a way that we're not on our site. And what happened was, as a result of that, we actually created a special section that sold against advertising for the print paper. So I think what Fergus is alluding to is actually very, almost inherently in some of these platforms, the ability to be more youthful or mix-up storytelling exists like at the outset.
I absolutely agree, but I'd also say that if you work in an organization that is fortunate enough to have tech resources and developers, you're really missing out if we're not involving them in newsroom innovation as well. Simply because if you have journalists solve problems, you get journalists solutions. And journalists are very many good things, but we're not the ordinary readers or users or viewers out there. Some of the best questions I get about news are from developers within our organizations. They're asking, why can't we atomize news? Why shouldn't we be able to reshuffle everything? Why shouldn't we have something that's reusable, like the basis of a good code stack? So they ask quite different questions, and having them sit together with journalists sort of release a new energy in solving problems instead of innovating in journalism. And I think in solving problems, we get a whole lot longer and further.
How did the journalists feel?
Actually, if you have the right journalists in those processes, and it might go terribly wrong sometimes too, but I will say that most journalists actually like being challenged and like being asked to look at their own profession in a new light and in a new perspective.
I think if you think about technical innovation and editorial innovation separately, you already have a problem in your organization, because what makes innovation successful is that you unite people behind a certain goal that they try to achieve, and they use the tools that they need to achieve. And that involves technology, editorial changes, workflow changes, and also cultural shift. But I think that it's important to realize, okay, so we realize we need to change, we need to achieve a new goal. How can we do that in an innovative way? And that should be the starting point of innovation, I think. But coming back to what you said, I think it's absolutely true that with some of these new platforms, it's almost like they force innovation on us, because Snapchat or other platforms, they set certain limits to what you can and cannot do with them. And mostly limitations trigger very creative processes, yeah. I find. So when we first started using Snapchat, we were first teaching ourselves how does it work, and it was in a very, very playful way, and that is slowly evolving now into a strategy. And I think creating that freedom inside a newsroom is really, really important, whether it's a startup or a big organization.
Talking about freedom, Gimlet Media shut down its regular production for a day or two to test how being free to the mandate of publishing could create the right environment to create and innovate and have new ideas and get to know each other more in a more free space. Is there a recipe? Is there something, would you want to do something like that in your newsroom if you had the chances?
It's certainly tantalizing, but I don't think I would, and I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think that boils down to what is the nature of journalism. It is wanting to cover the news and put stuff out, and telling ourselves, and at least telling our readers, God forbid they find out, that they can live without us for a day, a week. I really wouldn't want to risk that. I would love to take parts of the newsroom out of operation. To help them get into a new zone, try new things, absolutely. But I really, coming from legacy media, I'd say that staying on the pulse of the news is too important for us. Then again, that kind of pinpoints one of the other issues that sort of limits innovation in news organizations too. Because we are very efficient factories. I mean, most news organizations are extremely efficient news production factories. And what really is typical for a factory is that if something is threatening today's or tomorrow's output, it's all hands on deck. If it looks like you're not coming on air tonight, you're not putting out a new edition, or a bomb goes off in Brussels, it's really all hands on deck. And it's a wonderful thing of journalism. But if you can imagine sort of two axes, where the one is, this is very important, and the other is, this is very urgent. We have to do this right now. You will always execute on what's both urgent and important. In a newsroom, you will almost always execute on what's urgent, but not as important, just because you have this deadline rush. But the really important quadrant in sort of an axis is the things that are important, but not urgent. It won't change if you postpone that until tomorrow or the next day, and there's a news event, we need to do that. If we do not, as managers, set aside time and resources to execute on those things that are important and not urgent, and those get swallowed up so easily in newsrooms, it gives us a very bad standing for tomorrow's news events or the next year's news events, because we haven't prepared. And we haven't been able to sort of get our ducks in a row and implement the changes that would enable us to do better news coverage a year from now.
You mentioned early changing, having an end goal. In many talks about innovation and having to change, sometimes we even focus too much on change. Is there a risk of changing for the sake of change?
Well,
I think there is, absolutely. I mean, so one of the accusations against digital teams and legacy organizations is that the first question tends to be responding to the urgent, not the important, right? That they will say, and I think some of you can attest, they'll say, what time are you filing? Right? Does that sound familiar? What time are you doing this? Not the question that I think we should be asking, which is, what are you going to say? Right? What is the journalism that you're about to produce? And I think that's the more important question. So I think that there has been, in this rush to keep up, right? I mean, I'm sure all of us had to do something on the Brussels attack that you referenced. I mean, we're all covering a lot of the same stories. We're trying to basically game algorithms for search, for Facebook, for Twitter, for our own sites. I mean, so we're also across multiple platforms. We're trying to be first, and we're trying to be fast, and then we're also trying to be innovative. So in that mess, right, and it is kind of amazing that we do what we do because it is very chaotic every single day. I think it is worth somebody stopping and saying, well, what are we actually trying to say, and how are we going to distinguish ourselves? So one thing we've done at the LA Times that I think addresses this issue of the need to be both agile, right? Really nimble, really keep up with the news, but also stable. Let's have our brand really stand for something. And you know, if you come to the LA Times, that you're going to get news and information about California, traffic, the environment, race, immigration. I mean, like maybe 5 to 10 subjects that we're really going to dominate. How do we enable a newsroom to have everybody at least feel managed? And one of the, coming out of startup culture, how many of you, by the way, are in a startup of some sort, like under 3 years old, the company? Actually, not that many of you. You get to a stage where you grow and grow and grow, and your most effective manager at some point has 15 people reporting to them. Right, which you have to feel sorry for those 15 people, or if you're one of those 15 people. I mean, everybody needs care and feeding of a manager. They need nurturing, they need to understand, this is a good lead, this is a good photo with this story. I mean, there's a lot of training that I think we need to be doing that I think Legacy has actually done a pretty good job of. You know, I got my first job at the Associated Press, and I had editors that would literally sit next to me and say, this is bad, this is good, this is terrible, this is very good writing, do more of this, don't do any more of this ever again. I think that's a value that Legacy offers, and I want to continue to offer that, but if I have managers with 15, 20 reports to them, it's just not going to work. On the other hand, I need to have what we have now is like a news hub that enables us to essentially have our allegiance to the story. And so every day there are, developers sitting next to data viz, next to reporters, next to editors, next to photo editors, and it just allows for a moment in time in the newsroom where our only allegiance is to the story. And that's been our solution to keep up with all of you in this room and a potential attack in Brussels or in San Bernardino, as we had a few months ago. but still have the broader legacy kind of definition. You can count on the LA Times for these other types of stories that I think are the ones that also distinguish us significantly.
I just want to make a point about the change for sake of change and this necessity for change. I think sometimes we react when we should actually think ahead. So, Mitra, you're talking about publishing. I'm going to talk about news gathering. Facebook Live Video is here. Periscope is here. Newsrooms are woefully unprepared for it. In the Paris attacks, people, how many control rooms were scrambling to be able to put out live Periscope videos, or even work out if you should be putting out live Periscope videos. There is no excuse for that. People have been talking about it for months. You should be prepared for these things to happen. Working out your policy as the news is breaking is not acceptable. It's going to make you look amateur in front of your audience who knows how to navigate Periscope streams. So we have to find this balance between not investing so much of your time in innovation or looking to innovation and not knowing where you're going, and looking at the innovation that you need to make where you do know where it's going. We know that Facebook Live Video is going to be a thing. We need to prepare for that. And why aren't we? And I suspect so many people are not preparing for it and they will when news breaks in the first, momentous live video. And Mark Zuckerberg talking about it is not momentous enough, really.
We didn't want to agree all the time, but I'm afraid I have to
Don't agree.
agree. I mean,
yeah.
I don't get the sense that the news industry is known for change of this for the sake of change. If anything, the very broad, big pictures that we're lacking behind and having enough change. Yeah, you just mentioned like 5 things that we need to do. I think there are 50 more that we can do right away, and it's not the time, the resources, so to do them all. So I don't think there is change for the sake of change, unless there's an organization that panics and introduces changes that do not pursue any strategic goals.
No, but I think that's really important because, like you, I want to advocate thinking ahead and actually sometimes just playing with new technology that comes available. In my previous job, I headed up an innovation team at the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, which is Norway's public service broadcaster. And those guys have a very broad mandate on exploring and implementing new technology where it can improve the NRK's presence anywhere. So one of the guys got interested in Arduino little mini computers at the very beginning. And he didn't know what he was going to use it for, but he got a couple, they were cheap. So what did he do? He built a little robot that automated switching on the coffee maker. Because he had a sensor and it could feel someone coming in the room. Okay, I want to switch on the power to the coffee maker. Fine, it doesn't have a use case whatsoever, other than we had pretty good coffee for a while. But him being able to play with that, just in the spare time in between stuff, for a couple of years and keeping up with Arduino technology, all of a sudden led to him being able to combine that with, oh, here's a GoPro camera, that's fun. And we should really be able to have video from our radio studios, the NRK, those radio, TV, online, everything. Norway's biggest media company. And people started asking, why don't we have video, all the cool stuff that goes on in radio studios? And he thought, well, I think we could do that. And so he goes and puts up a little GoPro camera on the radio presenters' phones, and he installs one of those little Arduino-based sensors to figure out who is speaking. And then all of a sudden you have an automated radio studio. It costs probably less than $1,000. And you have really good quality video. And now they're able to actually produce TV productions based on that automated studio because he once wanted to make a coffee maker go on. And I want to advocate actually having some people being allowed to experiment with new technology as it comes out.
Can I just ask you, do you have developers sitting in the newsroom?
We do have some developers in the newsroom, yeah, but this was at a different organization who do also, by the way, have developers, but not as close to the newsroom.
You've been talking about something that lots of organizations might not have. In fact, 2 things. Time for people to be able to experiment and money for people to, it was less than $1,000. Well, yeah. That's a couple of freelancers.
But in a broadcasting kind of perspective, where you put, I don't know, almost €1 million into an outdoor broadcasting bus. It's peanuts. And it really saves a whole lot of money having someone being able to play with technology that costs $18. It just saves money in 5 years and not today. So in legacy media, that's actually one of the benefits you do have. You do have some time.
I would agree. I actually have a lot of examples like that, where a photographer played with Periscope, saw what's working. Our sports reporters do this a lot. And it actually is forcing them to innovate on web video, because then they'll break off of Periscope and say, actually, if I just post 20 seconds from this press conference, I'm guaranteed to find an audience on that. And that's not something I expected that the off-platform would benefit us just as far as getting a legacy newsroom to think about audience at every step of the way. There's other examples, like with 360 video. It's become almost kind of instinctual now when photographers are on the scene and they're in, a stadium is about to be built in this really disgusting looking parking lot. The instinct is, oh, well, how do we show this to readers best? That switch didn't take that long to suddenly go from where they were a year ago, 5 years ago, to what we're seeing today, because a lot of these tools, whether the tool is going to be Periscope in a year or two is irrelevant to me. It's that we've forced a photographer to be thinking in a new way.
But do you have a specific space for innovation to happen? Do you have a lab?
I hope what you just heard me articulate was that it's become by story, right? Does this story warrant a 360 video? Yes or no? A lot of newsrooms, I see the mistake where they separate it and they'll do 360 video, and I'll be like, that's not really something I would have wanted to consume on 360. It feels like you innovated a project versus looked at a story and thought about me and wanting to literally see 360 degrees of a visual. So we have not separated it. There are, obviously, we have a projects team, and enterprise has separate reporters, but I would also think even that is woven into our day-to-day.
But you, Sebastian, have a space that fully dedicated to innovate, because you're young, small team, free to experiment, and you're 1 year old now. So what have you learned from this that makes a case for having that kind of freedom to experiment?
So it's been 8 months, and we launched with a beta phase. So I think our team, we were 3 or 4 people sitting together for 2 weeks, and then we went public. So yeah. A lot of the self-finding and self-defining process happened in public, which can be a painful process, but helped us tremendously, because we had the feedback from readers both qualitatively and quantitatively with the data. So that's something that is scary, but that I would always encourage. The other thing that helped us a lot is that we at least once a month get together and talk about one particular area of the way that we work. So whether it's workflow, or whether it's analytics, or whether it's 360 video. So just last week, for example, we looked at every single article from March and how they did on social and on our website, and that kicked off a discussion on, so we had on the whiteboard, we had one column for what do we want to do more of and what do we want to do less of. And not just in terms of topics, but also in terms of how do we approach the story, what kind of headlines did we use, what type of images do we use, did we do enough seeding on that story. And out of that very free discussion, we came up with immediate to-dos. And that is something that's very important to me, that the outcome of these meetings is something that we change right away. Because for me, also a problem with this wonderful method called design thinking is that you need to make that transition into everyday workflows. So we always end by saying, okay, so starting now, we're gonna change this and that, and it's not more than 3 things at a time. But we've been doing this continuously every week, and so far it worked really well for us as a process.
Can I ask a question about the voices that are represented in those discussions? So, it would be easy to take people who are digital natives, or who have experience in developing things, that's their background, and of course they're going to come up with it. But what about the mix between the old hacks, the hardcore journalists who are really focused on the story, all that's all the technology never got in the way for them. So how do you manage the kind of across-the-board representation in discussions about innovation?
So all of this is very easy for me to say because we're a young team and there's only 7 of us on editorial staff. Everybody else can so there's sometimes 10, 11, 12 people in these meetings. And everybody gets to have a say in these. So I don't know how this is going to work if we continue growing, and if there's a bigger team, we probably need to make changes to this process. But even within that small team, there is a diversity. You have some people that the experience that they bring to the table is just very different. So sometimes you have someone who's been working on a news desk for 2 years before they joined Ze.tt, so that's helpful. And sometimes you have people who have no experience from a legacy newsroom whatsoever, and they look at stories very differently. And so far, we managed to have a very good discussion exactly out of these different experiences that people bring to the table.
There was a Niemann report a few weeks ago described 4 kind of people you meet in a newsroom going digital. And natives, the one just gets it. The naturals might not get it instinctively, but once they're told, they just get on board very easily. The collaborators, not very active, but will enable, will create the right condition for this to happen. And the fearful, how do you get the fearful on board?
That is very difficult, because I think a lot of time, it is really a question of fear. So how do you combat fear? Well, I think first of all, you acknowledge the parts of their skill set that is still valid. You need to acknowledge that, you know what, you're a really good journalist. You have terrific interview skills, so you write like a goddess, or whatever is your strong point. So you need to build some confidence in them that, you know what, the skills that made you a good journalist are still valid.
I agree, but I also disagree. I think for me, one of the best motivators is that thirst to be first. It's the competitive thing. This new tool that we're introducing, this new way of working, this is going to beat the competition. I also find that big screens are important for that to tap into the ego. So if you're in a newsroom,
I was going to say once the fearful go viral, there's no turning back. I think that's actually been the answer for every legacy journalist, where you say, could you just reorient a little bit this way? We'll work on the headline, we'll work on the photo, you'll see what happens. And it's like they become kind of they've suddenly switched from the fearful. I would even say they've skipped past collaborator, because then they just keep wanting to repeat that success.
They become ambassadors. Once you've had a success story, you can see that I can do this. So it's like you would fight a phobia. You expose yourself to what's scary, if it's spiders or if it's
ego,
the internet.
is fine too.
Yeah.
Ego, shame is quite good. I found that, I really like when people talk about the screens displaying chart beat or parsley in their newsrooms, and people get to see their stories going to the top. And I think, so if people want to see their thing get to the top, whatever the thing might be and whatever way they get to see it, I think ego we as journalists, we have egos. We didn't get into news to shrink into the background. We want our voices to be heard. And in innovation, that applies as well, I think. Well, you can appeal to that side.
And then the other shift from a startup to a legacy outlet. So when I was at Quartz, and my colleague Annalisa Morelli is here from Quartz, so you should probably talk to her about the way it works now, because my information's all a year old. But the content creator was really responsible in many ways for the headline, the photo, the article, with a lot of input from people around using chat and Slack and so forth. In the organization I work in now, there's literally dozens of people in the presentation of the story. And I think one thing that Chartbeat and other metrics programs don't allow us to readily do, and as senior managers we need to do, is to celebrate those people where their tweaks help because if you think about one piece of copy, the number of fearful or potentially fearful around that, from copy editors to photo editors to the layout artist, is manyfold. And my job is to make sure that they understand that their tweaks and how that translates into metrics online are actually celebrated across the organization, which I don't think that startups to legacy we always do as great a job of.
Can I ask you a question though? How did Quartz manage to stay innovative as they grew? Because they probably grew very quickly as well, and now they still produce, they seem to produce innovation quite quickly. Can you?
I'm looking at Annalisa.
Should we widen?
I know we can. I think it's part. I mean, I think like one basic thing I learned was the seating arrangement was incredibly democratic, and I don't put that lightly. I mean, I sat next to I was executive editor, and I sat next to a 22-year-old. That 22-year-old completely changed the way that I spoke about everything, because suddenly I had to articulate why we do things the way we do and what the basis of everything from journalism to, again, visual decision making is. So I think some of it was just, it truly was a democratized workplace by virtue of who's sitting where, developers next to reporters, next to editors. We similarly had people who would do the coffee machine, the coffee is hot, the coffee is cold, and various light bulbs going off. The weather, if it's about to rain, a purple light bulb would go off. So there were all these things that I think didn't, actually this is very significant, it didn't separate us from the world that we lived in and that we consumed content in. And I think that's really important. The people there all had lives, and there were reminders of that life in the workplace. It wasn't walled off.
Well, but I think we're onto something here, because physical, how you set up your newsroom physically actually plays a major role too. I love what you're saying about you as executive editor sitting next to a 22-year-old. I'm in a legacy newspaper. Yeah, we still produce a newspaper in print, and you can come into our newsroom and you can tell by the way it's set up that, oh, this is organized to facilitate the production of a print newspaper. We're looking to change that, because just having people sitting differently and meeting different people will facilitate different discussions. And having people talk to different people than they usually do, just that gets the imagination going.
I want to build on that, but bring it back to that innovation and technology that we spoke about earlier. I assess a lot of tools and a lot of workflow systems, and so many of them, oh, we've got this great solution, you can talk, we can message this to your colleague, we can put this here, we can do, and actually, I think that the best tools take a step back from that and allow the shouty-outy bits of a newsroom. I think there's nothing better for a newsroom when there's a buzz of a breaking story and and you can stand up and talk to the person opposite you, or just turn quickly to the person next to you to get the element moving that you need to do it. Yes, there might be a more efficient way to log that, but that's not the way that a newsroom culture works, and it's not the way that we really want to work. We want to talk to people. And so I think that the way you're set up is actually so important for that social part of being a journalist.
But also, Slack being one of the new channels, now everyone is Slack, and yet I know many newsroom where you need to send an email to say, oh, I wrote you on Slack, can you just go? So is it not almost counterproductive then to have too much of these tools without really going through change?
I read a lot about the way that Slack suggests you set it up. And actually, I've seen newsrooms try and set Slack up. And what newsrooms will do is they'll go, okay, we need a channel for this, we need a channel for this, we need a channel for this. Oh, and we need a management channel for this so that no one else sees that conversation. And how do we have a private conversation? Whereas Slack actually advocates, you've got to start with as fewer channels as possible, and then as you see a need, you spill out. And that's the technologists speaking who have designed a system, but it's incompatible with that old way that newsrooms are structured, and the two need to find a way to meet in the middle. But actually, if they embrace Slack as it was meant to be embraced, or Slack had a conversation with newsrooms, they might find a common ground. But Slack is great if you use it properly, like all of these tools.
But what if you cannot change the setup of a physical newsroom? You cannot turn things upside down, and yet you still have to try to adapt and move on. How do you do that?
Why can't you?
Well, maybe because you don't have the resources and you can't change building and you can't...
But you can physically tell to someone, hey, you two switch places.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be harder than that.
So that's what we did with the News Hub. We basically carved out a space, and then a bunch of us will go out with laptops. And, you know, it's not ideal. It's not a loft space. We're in I don't know how old the building is. I don't think it's 135 years old, but it should be more than 100 years old. It's a very old building. So we're in a similar situation to what you're describing of we can't just physically move everybody, but we can move some people and make it a rotation so that at least more people from different sections are thrown together compared to how they used to be. And that's kind of been our solution for the short term.
We've actually also instituted a new journalistic practice. It's called The Mission, and it happens about 4 to 5 times a year, where a group of journalists and photographers are given one topic to go into in depth. And that is the only thing they do. They move into a conference room, set up a whole separate little newsroom, and they start covering. It has been the climate coming up to the Paris conference. It has been entrepreneurship, because we live in a tech-heavy town. It can be anything. But they are people who don't usually work together. They still output content every day during those 2 weeks. They help us fill the pages of the newspaper. They help us have the running of the website. It's not like it doesn't happen anything for those 2 weeks and then you have a whole big project. No, they are part of ongoing publishing, but they work together. And they make, last time we had a reporter from the culture department working with a video journalist for the first time in his life. And just bringing new people together is something you can do as long as you have people who don't usually work together. And there comes beautiful things out of that, if not just a new conversation.
We mentioned having a young staff who's sitting next to a 22 years old. Is there, being young, just one fundamental criteria? And
I know some seriously young 60-year-olds. And I also know some very, very old 30-year-olds. So age is more of a mental state than a physical thing. But yeah, there is a generational aspect of it. I think where having grown up with the internet is a difference to those who have not. But I think that is dissolving.
Before we came into this session, we were talking about Snapchat and how we know how it works, but why we don't use it, and we really don't get it.
Why you don't use it?
For the record, I came late. I do use Snapchat. So. And I think I'm one of the older people on this.
I started using it, but we have to know how to use it. We have to try and embrace it, and it is really hard, I think.
I was just going to say on the age issue, one thing I think a lot of us do, and our editor-in-chief does a good job of this, when we have new hires, he's very explicit that we hired you to be you. So don't go into a legacy organization and feel like in order to survive, you have to start being like everybody else, which might speak to I know some very old 30-year-olds, because sometimes I think a survival instinct kicks in, and suddenly they're writing prose and they've forgotten that they grew up on Snapchat or what have you. So we do try to, in our hiring process, be really explicit in people needing to be themselves. And we hope that they remain themselves. We kind of keep an eye on that.
do you think there is a special way of training in innovation, or is just part of everyday the process of the everyday work, or do you need specific space and training? And today we innovate, so
actually I think sometimes bringing the word innovation into it actually hinders innovation, because you feel, oh, I have to think this important big thought that I've never thought before, or I have to boldly go where no man has ever gone before. And there are two kinds of innovation. There's disruption, where you go off and do something completely new. And that doesn't come very often from within the news industry. I have to say the most disruption in the media industry comes from startups or from other sorts of platform companies. And then you have continuous improvement, which is what we do every day. and having to term everything over innovative or we're innovating today, I think is actually counterproductive in a whole lot of cases, because what you want to do is have someone go a little bit further, learn a little bit more. Okay, so today we're looking at your data. Today we're looking at stats. Today you are trying out Facebook Live. Why not? But stop labeling it innovation, because it actually scares some people.
I think there's a lot to be said for the physical act of training and learning as well, which I think has been slightly lost. I hate learning by webinar. I absolutely hate it. I don't find that it's useful, and and a pre-recorded webinar is even worse.
Your live stream seems to wave
okay.
to people right now.
But
but I think, I mean, interacting, but learning, but if you just have a kind of set thing, people need to be able to ask questions, and the act of asking questions can also help, they can ask the questions that their peers are thinking about asking, and I think it needs to be a lot more collaborative, the training, and a lot more physical. But that's my opinion.
But I also have great faith in actually allowing people to figure out how to solve a problem, not necessarily train them to do a task. Because, there's a lot of theory about how people actually learn. You learn mostly by doing your job, and you learn new skills.
It's important to tell people from the point that you hire them that it's okay to do certain things in your organization. I think that for me is key, that it's okay to, without asking top management to, do you try something new on Snapchat? So it's very much a cultural thing. I know it's very liberating to put Post-its on a wall, but so many times I've seen, people, then the most they do is take a screenshot with their iPhone, and then, that's it. So the best case scenario is probably innovation happening kind of like in everyday newsroom culture, but I know that's kind of like an ideal scenario that you can strive for and that you have to make possible culturally.
What I always find interesting is that we think of BuzzFeed and new players as being the innovators and being creative and being free from the legacy burden to try, and yet those companies usually rely heavily on analytics and data and like structure that little has to do with creativity. So how do you keep together a very structured data focus approach with the freedom of just have an amazing new idea and create a new product?
But it's that they're using data in creative ways, I think. So that's what I was trying to say earlier. I mean, data is just one of the building blocks that you can use to be innovative. I mean, sometimes it can kickstart innovation because you see in the data that something's not working and you need to fix that. Sometimes you think about solutions, and data can help you verify or falsify one of the solutions. So data is just a means to an end in a way, and I think I assume these organizations are using data very creatively to kind of test what the direction that they're going into.
So I actually think this is a huge issue, not just for legacy, but BuzzFeed and the likes are struggling in terms of they've gauged a certain type of metric really well, but as we're looking to off-platform and in some cases you can't quantify views, let alone engagement, what our judgment of what works is also changing, and the area that I've struggled with is finding metrics, people who understand how the journalism comes together so that they can help us make informed decisions on, should we do that again? Did people spend 1 minute more because of X factor? Was there, did this story completely flop, but the video version on Facebook had 2 million views? I mean, I feel like I'm still, and I don't know how many of you feel the same way, getting metrics kind of, that's how angry I am about this. No, I'm getting metrics very, very separately as opposed to unifying behind a story. And, we publish hundreds of pieces of content a day. My hope is that eventually the advocates for a story, all the people that I mentioned, the editors, the content creators themselves, start to take responsibility for that, but there's still just a gulf of knowledge. So if people have thoughts on that, I would actually love to hear it, because it's an area that I'm struggling with myself.
Does anyone have thoughts on that? I'm serious. Do you have questions? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Just while they're thinking, I think both of you have raised questions, you're kind of asking the questions which actually the industry might be able to help answer. And I think one thing we haven't really touched on yet is innovation through collaboration. And we've seen collaborative stories, and there's a huge collaborative story going on at the moment, but not necessarily in the innovation. The session that was speaking before in here, the Coral Project, that is technical collaboration for innovation. But my feeling is that there is a certain base level of knowledge that it's being acquired across the industry that we can learn from and help boost each other, that's non-competitive, or answer those questions that you're asking each other. And a conference space isn't just the place to be able to do it. There should be potentially a dialogue to be able to do that.
It's funny, a lot of, when Chartbeat came in the other day and I said, I've been looking for metrics from other organizations. I think probably all of us do this. We're in secret, we have friends and we kind of swap information back and forth, and thank you to all of you who partake in that. But they said that there's been a reticence from the industry of joining that. So very much underscores what you're saying. There is a program we've had some luck with called Spike, which helps you gauge social shares by region and demographics. And that's just, again, for a regional outlet like ours, has been immensely valuable on how are we stacking up compared to others. But it's a tiny slice of a very, very large picture.
Do you have anything to add? Questions?
Thank you. Rasmus Nielsen, I'm Director of Research at the Reuters Institute. It seems to me that early on in the conversation you all touched on an issue that seems to be central to the challenge of innovation, which is that innovation is about developing better means for certain ends. And it seems to me, as an analyst looking at the industry, that the problem much of the industry faces is that they don't know what the ends are. And when you don't know what the ends are, it's hard to innovate better means towards those ends. So very crudely put, most media organizations in the 90s operated in the world of scarcity. There was limited content out there, so every piece of journalism you did added value, editorial, but also commercially, because you sell advertising, there was limited advertising space. Now, media organizations operate in a space of abundance, so it is no longer the case that every piece of journalism you do adds value, and it is certainly no longer the case that there is a commercial or business case for doing every piece of journalism you used to do. So I think it would be useful for us to hear a little bit more about sort of stepping back from the organizational issues of do you have developers in the newsroom, where is the product team placed, how the chairs are arranged, to hear a bit more about how you engage with strategy development in your organization so that your innovation can actually serve ends of the organization that you work in, or even help your organization develop goals for a new media environment.
I absolutely agree that this is one of the biggest challenges at the moment. It used to be that the key KPI is how many people can you drive to your website, because that's where you monetize, that's where you sell advertising. But we're slowly and sometimes very quickly shifting to a world where it's important to have maybe people read your instant articles because you're selling mobile ads in those articles now. So whenever we do workshops that I talked about, I try to be clear about what the overall strategic goal is for Ze.tt. So what is it that we actually try to achieve and why that is important to us. And I think to some extent that is something that has to come out of, top management, or in my case, the project lead, that people can know in what direction do I need to be looking. But I absolutely agree that this is very challenging and almost shifts from week to week ever so slightly what it is that we try to optimize and innovate for.
I think you're pointing at something that's really important to us in legacy institutions. It's also a question of our self-understanding as journalists and editors. What is it we do? Because we need to move from the place where my job is to help put out a paper every day, which was what people had, well, the sort of understanding you had of your job as a journalist, to I am playing this role in these people's lives, and people are paying for that because. I was saying earlier that I think top newsroom management is so important in trying to paint a picture of what sort of territory you're moving into. And right now I don't think we know. And that's the difficult part, because no one has the solution quite yet. We are starting to formulate the questions or the reasons for being in a post-scarcity sort of media economy. But I don't think a lot of newsroom executives are able to formulate that quite clearly to newsroom staff. And I think that is something we're seriously lacking. And it's something that would also help release new innovative power within the newsroom. Because, you know, our job is to help find a way up there. We know sort of what it looks like up there. We're not quite sure how to get there. Okay, fine. That's when you can be tight on strategy, losing control, right? When you can actually empower people to do their own experiments and say, yeah, that's fine, that might be helpful, do that. I think this is pinpointing the identity crisis, at least of legacy media right now, because we don't know what the future business model is, and we don't know what the future sort of loyalty model for journalism is. But what I find really encouraging is that we're starting to talk more about the people who actually read or use our products, which is something, for some reason, that the media industry very rarely does. So we're talking more about people, and I think that's a good place to start.
I'm not in a specific news organization at the moment, but my take on this is that the news industry is qualified to work out what the end is, and if we don't work it out for ourselves, then other people are going to come and tell us what that is, which is, I think, what is happening to some extent at the moment. Technology companies, platforms are telling us what the end is, and we're going, oh, okay, that's it. We should probably get there then. But actually, we have the experience, we have the data, we have the innovative ability to work out what the end might be, and not being told what it is and following that. I don't think is the only way. Since you're going to disagree with me. You're looking at me as if you're about to pounce.
Am I? No, I think I agree with you. I mean, I actually feel like what you underscore is, I don't say this to be flip, but it's to save democracy. I mean, I try to create monetizable audiences. I try to find relevance among existing readers. I try to find new readers. But a part of the reason that we don't articulate our mission at the 134-year-old LA Times every hour, every day, and perhaps the way that I did in other startups is because our mission is so fundamental to democracy and to the city that we live in that it perhaps doesn't need re-articulating all the time, except in a climate where there is a threat to the way we not just do journalism but do business. And other people might come along and tell us what to do. So actually, I don't disagree with you.
We're still trying to find something to
disagree
on.
I know.
Yeah, but I'm still wondering, it's such a big organization. Is there a need to reassure people of the business model that you have?
Oh, very. So one area that has been interesting to watch is subscriptions, which was a pretty big part of our last year. And subscriptions is one of those things where, yes, you could get into the nitty-gritty of paywalls and how you do it and when you block people off, but the one thing that it just helps you have a conversation among different stakeholders is what is the value of this organization? What is the value of our advertising? What is the value of our news? What is the value of verticals that we might start offering? What is the value of the print product versus the website? I mean, it forced the conversation. So very much so. The only issue I would caution against in having to articulate a successful monetization strategy to a large group of people is that the inclination becomes to keep the runway on print as long as you can. And I'm trying to reorient a newsroom for a future and almost to accept a constantly flexible, adaptable future, and thus keep our runway endless, right?
More questions?
Or a runway would be like infinite scroll. How's that for
how's
that for an analogy?
Question, what should J schools, journalism schools do to help you a little bit?
I got this one. Because I was just recently I was at a university in the UK. I was asked to go and attend the final session of a module on innovation and entrepreneurial journalism, in which students who were put into groups presented their journalistic business ideas. And I think that's the kind of thing that people need to start thinking about, not because of the actual products that come out of it, but that way of thinking. And I was so impressed by this. I actually called up my old university and said, I was having a chat with them, and I said, how can your students not know what Google Cardboard is? How can your students not know what instant articles are? And so the other side, apart from kind of the entrepreneurial element, it's preparing them for the future, preparing them for the things that they need to know, not giving them a misguided view that they're going to be able to become anchors when that kind of TV isn't going to exist for much longer. It's about telling them, the platforms where the news is existing or will exist, and prepare them to adapt their own thoughts on what a role might be. So that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, not to sell, student projects, but just to get them thinking in that way, and also preparing them for the future. Just like we're looking to the future, I think students need to look, because if it's a 3-year degree course, year one, their aspirations for a role when they finish are going to look very different by the time they're in year 3, and they probably have nothing to do with what they've learned through the process. It's the developments in the industry.
I would say 2 things too for J schools. I mean, if I was teaching at journalism school today, I'd do at least 2 things. One, I would throw my students off in the deep end of the pool in the first week and say, here's your iPhone, go out and tell the story. And have them figure out how, because figuring out how is going to be such an important skill. And today the biggest tool is the smartphone. Tomorrow it might be something else, but familiarizing yourself with unfamiliar technology is going to be part of it too. But the other thing I would do is try to instill in them a sense that, there is a future in journalism. Because right now we are down-talking our industry so badly. I'm meeting journalism students who are crying and saying, I don't think I'll ever find a job in this industry. I had 2 emails about that for people doing their bachelor's in journalism last week. And I think both as journalism teachers and as senior newsroom people, we need to be saying that there is a future in this profession and it's going to be great.
So I'll differ only a little bit on this, because it struck me as I came to this conference and was looking at the itinerary, and I go to a lot of conferences, and I compare it to what I went to 10, 15 years ago, and I feel like once upon a time there was a lot more focus in our industry on writing and editing, and I don't feel like I hear that anymore, which is just the purity of how we do what we do, and how you ask somebody a question, and how you get them to feel comfortable with you, and how you talk to a woman who's just lost her son, and these are not natural things. Now, they do come from, you might take your iPhone and just go out and have to figure it out for a week, and you insult about 100 people before you finally figure out how to be...
you should not teach basics.
But it's just something that strikes me and I also go to I used to teach at journalism school, and we were increasingly teaching digital as though that was somehow different from the journalism. And a part of the reason I re-entered Legacy after a long time away was just because I was really worried that the pool of reporters we were creating was divorced from the actual journalism that must be done every day to get the story, and the digital tools it often takes to deliver that story. And I think distribution and the strength of the journalism have everything to do with each other. So I would almost say a back to base. I hate to give you different answers, but we were looking for something to disagree on.
The thing is, I don't disagree either. Basics and experimentation, and that's a pretty good mix.
And I have nothing to add.
We're just so smart.
No, I would emphasize the experimentation bit. If we continue at the current pace, J-School students probably have to get used to a new app every, 2-3 years or so? So it's not actually about knowing how to use app A or B, but it's about how to, get used to the next one really quickly and be open to using a new one almost every year.
And also, if you apply that same kind of academic approach to analyzing or assessing a tool or researching it, by the time you finish that process, the company might have folded, and your students will never ever actually come into contact with it.
It'd be fun to actually develop a framework for what it means to get used to an app. So think about what are the strengths of that app, what are the weaknesses, what can I do poorly with that app, what is the specific audience, what kinds of stories can I tell with that app. So I would probably go through that framework with every new app, and then ask students to tell a story with each app in a way that is specific to the app.
More questions?
Christopher from a political newspaper, Altinget in Denmark. You talk a lot about how to innovate in technology. What about innovating in language, how you write things? Have you comments on that?
I mean, a problem that is specific to us in addressing a young audience is how young do we want our language to be? And this was very much an iterative process, and because we started out with a younger language than we have now, so now we feel comfortable with the way that we address our readers. But this was very much, a hit and miss process, but also something that we sometimes addressed specifically in one of our meetings, and we went through articles and would say, oh, this sounded kind of like we try to be younger than we actually are, and since we're all in our 20s, we're not just writing for ourselves. I'm 31, I'm lying. But yeah, so we're just using language that we're comfortable with. And again, this is something that can happen in everyday life, and this is also something you can make specific in a meeting using examples.
So this is an area that actually has been, again, a part of the reason that I came to the LA Times was to shake up the way that we've always done things. And so there's a few hires we've made. We're in that process of telling them to be themselves. They actually report in the crowd. One person who comes to mind is our reporter who covers Black Twitter and communities online. His name is Dexter Thomas. And he'll literally tell the crowd what he's working on as he's working on it. His writing reflects a part of that reporting, which happens on the phone as well as on Twitter or Facebook or other Tumblr, Medium. He's in a lot of places. And so there's a conversational tone in his stories that's completely different from the way the LA Times has always written itself. It's completely different from a Medium post or 140 characters on Twitter, and it feels distinctly like him, but also a way for us to leverage this reporting model potentially to other spaces. So that's just one example of experimentation. I'm a big fan of what you're describing. The internet, I think we all know, is a very intimate place and very authentic. You can't be something you're not, so if we're hiding behind big words and official, I've been covering this for 5 years, so don't ask me anything else. I mean, that's just not going to work.
Hi, Renee Kaplan from the FT. I want to ask Mitra a question. You opened earlier sort of talking about going back to a legacy and nonetheless thinking about the identity of this, even though it had hundreds of years of identity already. How do you think about that across off-site platforms, across social, like voice and identity?
So sometimes I actually say this when we're talking about our efforts on Snapchat or Facebook or Tumblr, and I'm like, I hope that we don't have to add an asterisk, actual reporting was committed to bring you this journalism. But I'd like people to know that the LA Times does stand indeed for actual reporting and journalism. And so that, again, I don't want to sound flip, but we are different from, while we run first-person essays and opinion pieces, that's not all we are. And I think that our brand is distinguished by still being youthful and voicey in the way that other platforms almost force, but also being known for a few things. I mean, LA is an incredibly hip, creative place right now. I want us to imbibe the feeling of the city And in the process, the LA Times changes as the city of Los Angeles is changing, right? And that's just, it's actually something worth noting. You know, I spent the last 10 years in national media, and a lot of the startups like Quartz and 538 and Vox are of a journalism that is global and intimate because they're digital, but they're not geographically rooted to a place. And so the benefit I have is that I have a readership where, you know, they see a neon sign and a palm tree and they know exactly what I'm talking about as far as LA being like a hip, edgy place. I know because it's right outside my house. And I want that vibe. So I think a lot about that when we're off platform. Are we exuding creativity? This is a city that I'm also, I don't want to go on and on, but I get a little bit meta with it. So Snapchat, for example, is based in Los Angeles. A part of the reason that I've been so focused on Snapchat is because Snapchat is our social media platform. So it's a business that we cover. So we've actually used Snapchat to cover Snapchat when we're trying to capture the views and like an eyeball versus a view, right? Which has been a huge issue with YouTube versus Snapchat. We actually use Snapchat to tell that story about Snapchat. To me, that's very LA Times, because it's only the LA Times that would care about the local business in such a way, and also be really creative in its storytelling. I think that's probably the best example I have. The other thing is I don't want people to feel like we're writing about LA for New Yorkers, right? I want this to feel very authentically like it's the Los Angeles view of the world versus the, and I say this as a New Yorker who moved to LA, so I'm pretty self-conscious of that.
Hi, my name's Guy Deegan. I'm a freelance journalist. Great panel, really interesting. Design thinking is gaining a lot of traction in media. Would anyone like to just offer some insights, lessons learned? How has it gone applying those sorts of practices in the newsroom?
I'd say that we didn't stick to it in a very strict sense, but we roughly followed the steps that you were asked to go through. And the most important thing for me about design thinking is that it's user-centric. So one of the first things we did was to talk to potential readers, do focus groups, do very long interviews with them, ask them about how they consume the media, what they would expect from us, and so on. And the information they gave us, the wordings they gave us, that was the foundation to what we built on top of that. And we actually developed one specific persona, and we called her Larissa. She's 22 years old. She's not a real person, but she kind of like lives in our heads until this very day. And the other day we said, well, maybe we need to like update her or find her a boyfriend, because we need to like extend our audience and think about her in a different way. But it became very, very like a very strong visual in our heads and in our minds. And that to me is probably the biggest benefits of using that method.
We've been doing some very limited experiments in using design thinking. I'd say up until now they haven't been hugely successful, but I think it's because we've been throwing the wrong questions at it. Because, like you, I have really great faith in the audience-facing aspects of design thinking, and actually forcing journalists to talk to people about the journalistic products. So that's something I'm really looking forward to experimenting more with.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you to our panel.
Thank you.